Picture this: a medieval marketplace buzzing with activity, merchants haggling over prices, artisans selling their crafts, and in the shadows of the towering cathedral, a monk with ink-stained fingers contemplates the morality of it all. What is a fair price? Is it ethical to charge interest? Can profit-seeking coexist with Christian virtue? These weren't just abstract questions in medieval Europe. They were urgent moral dilemmas that shaped economies, laws, and lives. Welcome to the fascinating world of scholastic economics, where theology and commerce collided to create economic theories that still echo in our modern markets. The year is 1225, and across Europe, a revolution in economic thinking is quietly unfolding alongside the more visible transformation of Gothic cathedrals reaching toward the heavens. As stonemasons carve intricate sculptures, scholastic thinkers are carving out equally intricate economic theories, attempting to reconcile Christian theology with the increasingly complex commercial reality of medieval towns and trade routes. Scholasticism emerged as an educational movement in the 11th century, reaching its peak between the 12th and 14th centuries. It wasn't initially focused on economics at all. It began as a method of learning that emphasized dialectical reasoning, where questions were posed and arguments were made from all sides to reach logical conclusions. This approach would be applied to theology, philosophy, and eventually economic matters. To understand scholastic economics, we must first grasp the world that produced it. The early Middle Ages saw a predominantly agrarian economy with limited trade. Most people lived as peasants on feudal manors, producing primarily for subsistence and local consumption. But by the 11th century, things were changing dramatically. The Crusades had opened new trade routes to the east, cities were growing, and a merchant class was rising in prominence. Banking systems were developing, and money was becoming more important than ever before. The Church, as the dominant intellectual and moral authority, couldn't ignore these developments. After all, Jesus had expelled the money changers from the temple, and biblical passages warned about the dangers of wealth. Yet the Church itself was becoming increasingly wealthy and involved in financial affairs. This contradiction demanded resolution. Enter the Scholastics, religious scholars who sought to reconcile the practical realities of economic life with Christian ethics. They operated primarily within cathedral schools and the emerging universities of Paris, Oxford, and Bologna, where they developed sophisticated analyses of economic activities. The towering figure in scholastic economics was undoubtedly Thomas Aquinas. Born in 1225 near Naples to an aristocratic family, Aquinas joined the Dominican order despite family opposition. By the time of his death in 1274, he had produced works that would influence economic thought for centuries to come, particularly his masterpiece, the Summa Theologica. Aquinas didn't write economics textbooks as we know them today. Instead, economic questions were addressed within broader theological and moral frameworks. One of his most significant contributions was the concept of the just price. In an age before modern market theory, Aquinas argued that there was an objectively fair price for goods based on their intrinsic value and the labor required to produce them. The value of a thing, wrote Aquinas, should be determined by its general utility to man, not merely by the seller's estimation or the buyer's desire. This idea challenged pure market-based pricing and suggested that economic transactions should be guided by moral considerations. Consider the grain merchant in 13th century France who has stockpiled wheat before a famine. Should he charge what desperate people are willing to pay, potentially enriching himself while others starve? Aquinas would say no. The just price should reflect the true value of the grain, not the temporary extreme need of buyers. This wasn't merely theoretical. Town authorities often set maximum prices for essential goods during scarcity, reflecting this scholastic principle. The question of usury, lending money at interest, was perhaps the most intensely debated economic issue among the scholastics. The Bible seemed clear on this matter. If you lend money to any of my people with you who is poor, you shall not be like a moneylender to him, and you shall not exact interest from him." Building on this, the Third Lateran Council of 1179 had declared that usurers should be denied Christian burial and excommunicated. Yet, as commerce expanded, credit became increasingly necessary. How could this circle be squared? Scholastics developed nuanced analyses that gradually carved out exceptions to the usury prohibition. Robert of Coursant, a French theologian who died in 1219, distinguished between consumptible goods, like food or money which are used up in consumption, and non-consumptible goods, like a house which can be used without being consumed. Since money was considered consumptible, charging for its use seemed like charging twice, once for the money itself and once for its use. But what if the lender suffered a loss by not having access to their money? The concept of lucrum cessans, cessation of profit, emerged to address this. If a merchant could have made a profit with the money they lent, compensation for this lost opportunity might be justified. A vivid example comes from the career of Francesco di Marco d'Attini, the merchant of Prato, who lived from 1335 to 1410. His extensive business records show how merchants navigated these moral complexities. D'Attini would often disguise interest charges as gifts or exchange rate differentials in international transactions to avoid the technical definition of usury. Meanwhile, scholastic theologians were developing theories that would eventually legitimize such practices, distinguishing between legitimate compensation for risk or opportunity cost and exploitative usury. By the 14th century, scholastic thinking had evolved significantly. Nicole Oreim, a Norman bishop who died in 1382, wrote De Moneta, on money, one of the first treatises focused specifically on monetary theory. Oresme argued that money belonged to the community, not just to the prince, and condemned currency debasement as a form of theft. This was no abstract concern. In 1295, Philip IV of France had debased the currency to finance his wars, causing economic disruption throughout the kingdom. The prince, Oresme wrote, may not by his authority alter the fixed price of money or receive any profit from such alteration, except perhaps in case of necessity or evident utility for the whole community. This clear limitation on royal power over the currency was revolutionary and foreshadowed later theories of sound money. Scholastics also developed sophisticated concepts of property rights. While the Church Fathers had often viewed private property with suspicion, Aquinas defended it on practical grounds. Private ownership, he argued, led to more careful stewardship of resources, reduced conflict over usage, and created more orderly human affairs. However, he qualified this by stating that in cases of extreme necessity, all property becomes common. This principle found concrete application during the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when crops failed across Europe. Church authorities, influenced by scholastic thinking, sometimes authorized the distribution of grain from wealthy monasteries and nobles to starving peasants, justifying this temporary suspension of property rights through Aquinas' principle of common use in extreme necessity. The scholastics' economic thought wasn't purely theoretical. It manifested in real institutions. The Montes Pietatis, Mountains of Piety, were charitable pawnshops established in 15th century Italian cities, offering small loans at low or no interest to the poor. The first was established in Perugia in 1462, and they spread rapidly throughout Italy. These institutions reflected the scholastic attempt to provide ethical alternatives to exploitative lending while acknowledging the necessity of credit in urban economies. The School of Salamanca, centered in Spain in the 16th century, represented the late flowering of scholastic economics. Confronted with the massive influx of gold and silver from the Americas and the resulting price inflation, scholars like Francisco de Vitoria and Luis de Molina developed sophisticated analyses of monetary dynamics. When prices rose across Spain following the treasure fleet's arrivals from the New World, These scholar priests were among the first to connect currency supply to price levels. In his lectures at Salamanca in 1544, Domingo de Soto explicitly linked American treasure to European inflation. The more abundant money is in Spain, the more the worth of things is valued. This was quantity theory of money centuries before Adam Smith or David Hume formalized it. The Salamanca scholars also made advances in value theory, approaching the subjective theory of value that would later become central to modern economics. Martín de Azpilicueta wrote in 1556 that all merchandise becomes dearer when it is in great demand and short supply, and that likewise money, when it is scarce, is more highly valued. These late scholastics were responding to the dramatic economic changes of their era. The discovery of the Americas had created new markets and introduced vast amounts of precious metals into the European economy. Traditional feudal bonds were breaking down, and commercial capitalism was emerging. The Protestant Reformation had challenged the Church's authority, including its economic teachings. By the 17th century, scholastic economics was being superseded by more secular approaches. Yet its influence continued. The natural law tradition, which influenced Adam Smith and other classical economists, had deep roots in scholastic thought. Even today, concepts like fair trade, corporate social responsibility, and ethical investing echo the scholastic concern with integrating economic activity and moral principles. The scholastics' greatest legacy may be their insistence that economics cannot be separated from ethics. In an age of algorithmic trading and global finance, their question remains relevant. How do we ensure that our economic systems serve human flourishing and the common good? The medieval marketplace we imagined at the beginning of our journey wasn't just a place of commerce. It was a testing ground for ideas about justice, fairness, and the proper relationship between material and spiritual values. As the merchant closed his ledger and the monk finished his treatise, both were participating in a conversation about economics that continues to this day. In our modern debates about income inequality, consumer protection, and the social responsibilities of business, we are walking paths first mapped by those scholastic thinkers who dared to ask not just how markets work, but how they should work in a society oriented toward the good life. The next time you hear debates about fair wages, ethical investing, or responsible business practices, remember that you're listening to echoes of conversations that began in medieval cathedral schools and universities. Conversations that shaped not just economic theory, but the very institutions and practices of the market economies we live in today.
We've got some amazing content coming your way. Subscribe now so you're first in line for fresh insights and all the good stuff you won't want to miss.